The autumn of 2008 was a bloodbath. The global financial system was experiencing a catastrophic, synchronized failure. Lehman Brothers had filed for the largest bankruptcy in human history. Credit markets were completely frozen. The housing bubble had detonated, sending shockwaves through every major international exchange. Panic was not just a sentiment. It was the only remaining currency. On Wall Street, the massive hedge funds were bleeding. Their long-term investments were collapsing into ash. To survive the massacre, these funds needed to find targets to short. They needed to find companies that were guaranteed to fail, bet billions of dollars against them, and ride the collapse all the way to the bottom. They looked across the ocean to Germany, and they saw what they believed was the perfect, bleeding victim: Volkswagen. At the time, the legendary German automaker was struggling. The global recession meant that consumers were not buying new cars, let alone expensive European imports. Volkswagen's debt was piling up, their sales were plummeting, and their stock price seemed artificially high compared to their dismal economic reality. For the apex predators of the financial world, shorting Volkswagen wasn't just a trade, it was free money. To short a stock, a hedge fund doesn't actually own the asset. They borrow shares from a broker, sell them immediately at the current high price, and wait for the company to crash. Once the stock plummets to the bottom, the fund buys the shares back for pennies, returns them to the broker, and pockets the massive difference. It is a bet built entirely on destruction. Throughout 2008, a swarm of elite hedge funds heavily shorted Volkswagen. They borrowed and sold millions of shares, creating a massive collective bet against the company's survival. They assumed they were the smartest men in the room, picking off a wounded giant in a dying market. But they were completely blind to the reality of the board. They weren't hunting a wounded giant. They were walking blindly into the most elaborate, ruthless mathematical trap ever constructed in the history of modern finance. And the architect of this trap was a boutique sports car manufacturer from Stuttgart. While the Wall Street hedge funds were busy betting against Volkswagen, the executives at Porsche were playing an entirely different game. Under the leadership of CEO Wendelin Wiedeking and his brilliant, hyper-aggressive chief financial officer Holger Harter, Porsche had quietly transformed. They were no longer just a company that built high-performance sports cars. Internally, they were operating like a ruthless, heavily leveraged hedge fund. Wiedeking and Harter had a grand, seemingly impossible ambition. They wanted the tiny, profitable Porsche to swallow the massive, sprawling Volkswagen empire whole. To execute a hostile takeover, they needed to buy shares of Volkswagen. But if they simply started buying massive amounts of stock on the open market, the price would skyrocket, and the German regulatory agencies would be alerted. If Wall Street knew what Porsche was doing, the trap would fail. So, Holger Harter utilized the shadows of the derivative market. He deployed a highly complex, secretive financial instrument known as a cash-settled option. Through a network of massive investment banks like Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley, Porsche aggressively bought options that gave them the right to the value of Volkswagen shares without forcing them to take physical ownership of the shares themselves. Because they were using derivatives instead of direct equity, Porsche was legally allowed to accumulate this massive economic interest in Volkswagen entirely in secret, bypassing the standard disclosure laws that would have warned the market. For months, as the global economy burned, Porsche quietly hoarded the supply. The Wall Street hedge funds kept aggressively shorting Volkswagen, entirely unaware that the shares they were borrowing and selling were effectively controlled by a single, unseen entity. The pressure in the system was building to a catastrophic breaking point. The hedge funds had built a house of cards, and Porsche owned the wind. The trap was finally sprung on a day when the market was entirely defenseless. On Sunday, October 26, 2008. While the trading desks in New York and London were closed and empty, Porsche issued a terse, terrifying press release. They casually announced that through their direct holdings and their massive secret stockpile of cash-settled options, They now effectively controlled 74.1% of all Volkswagen shares. To the untrained eye, this was just a corporate merger announcement. But to the quantitative analysts and hedge fund managers who read the release that Sunday afternoon, it was a mathematical death sentence. Here is why the math was fatal. Porsche now controlled 74.1% of the company. The German state of Lower Saxony, which had a historical mandate to protect the automaker, held an immovable 20% stake that they would never sell. Another 5% of the shares were permanently locked up in passive index funds. When you add those numbers together, 99.1% of Volkswagen's total stock was completely locked in a vault, unavailable to be traded. That left less than 1% of the shares actually floating in the open market. But the Wall Street hedge funds had shorted 12% of the company. When you are short a stock, you eventually have to buy the shares back to return them to the broker. It is a legal, binding obligation. The hedge funds collectively needed to buy 12% of the company to survive. But Porsche had just revealed that less than 1% of the company was actually available to buy. There were 12 desperate buyers for every one available share. The exits had been chained shut, the building was on fire, and Porsche was holding the only key. When the Frankfurt Stock Exchange opened the next morning, Monday, October 27th, all hell broke loose. The hedge funds realized they were trapped. Panic instantly replaced arrogance. They commanded their trading algorithms to buy Volkswagen shares immediately, at absolutely any price, to cover their short positions before their funds were entirely wiped out. But because Porsche controlled the supply, there were no sellers. The algorithmic bidding war spiraled out of control. The desperate, panicked buying triggered a phenomenon known as the ultimate short squeeze. Because the funds had to buy, and no one was willing to sell, the price of Volkswagen shares didn't just rise, it went completely vertical. In the middle of the worst financial collapse since the Great Depression, while every other stock on Earth was plummeting, the price of Volkswagen exploded. It shot from €210 a share to over €1,005 a share in a matter of hours. For one brief, shining, completely surreal moment in October 2008, Volkswagen bypassed ExxonMobil and Apple to become the most valuable publicly traded company on planet Earth. Its market capitalization briefly surged past $370 billion. But this wasn't value created by selling cars. It was synthetic value, created entirely by the desperate, localized panic of trapped Wall Street billionaires. The hedge funds were slaughtered. In the span of a few days, the elite predators of the financial system lost an estimated $30 billion. Legends of the industry were forced to liquidate their entire portfolios just to cover the catastrophic losses from this single, mathematically impossible trade. Porsche, meanwhile, made billions of dollars in paper profit. Wendelin, Wiedeking, and Holger Harter had executed the greatest short squeeze in financial history. But in the high-stakes world of corporate noir, absolute victories are rarely clean, and they are never permanent. Porsche had successfully squeezed the hedge funds, but they had severely underestimated the brutal, systemic reality of the 2008 financial crisis. To secretly buy up all those options and spring the trap, Porsche had borrowed roughly €10 billion from the major international banks. They assumed that once they took over Volkswagen, they could use Volkswagen's massive cash reserves to pay off the debt. But the credit markets were freezing solid. The banks, terrified by the global collapse, suddenly refused to extend Porsche's credit lines. The debt became a crushing, unavoidable weight. The hunter was suddenly caught in its own snare. Despite orchestrating the greatest financial maneuver of the decade, Porsche physically ran out of cash. They were drowning in the debt they used to build the trap. In a shocking, humiliating reversal of fate, Porsche was forced to surrender. To save themselves from total bankruptcy, they went to the very company they had tried to conquer. In 2009, Volkswagen agreed to a rescue package, turning the tables entirely. Volkswagen ended up buying the Porsche sports car business, absorbing the predator into its own empire. The men who built the trap, Wiedeking, and Harter were forced out of the company and would spend the next decade fighting criminal charges of market manipulation in the German courts. The Porsche Trap stands as the ultimate terrifying parable about the mechanics of leverage and the asymmetric danger of short selling. When you buy a stock normally, your risk is mathematically capped. If you invest $10,000, the absolute worst thing that can happen is the stock goes to zero, and you lose your $10,000. Your downside is fixed. But when you short a stock, the mathematics invert. Because you have to buy the shares back eventually, and because a stock's price can theoretically rise to infinity, your potential losses are absolutely infinite. The hedge funds in 2008 looked at Volkswagen's balance sheet and saw a dying company. They felt completely secure in their logic. But they forgot the golden rule of the financial battleground. Markets can remain irrational far longer than you can remain solvent. For the modern strategist, the lesson is written in the blood of the funds that collapsed that week. Never engage in a battle where your potential losses are mathematically limitless. If you rely on short-term margin, and you place yourself at the mercy of an opponent who secretly controls the supply, your intellect and your fundamental analysis will not save you. When the squeeze comes, the logic of the market completely evaporates, and only the one who holds the physical asset dictates the price of survival. This closes Case File 017.